Hello everyone. Welcome back to Nightmare Vault. Tonight, I am taking you deep into the heart of Kentucky, where the dead refuse to stay buried. In this episode, we will explore 8 bone-chilling cemetery encounters that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. From the hallowed grounds of Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville to the forgotten burial sites scattered across the Bluegrass State, these are the stories that emerge from Kentucky's most haunted graveyards. Each account has been meticulously researched and documented, drawing from eyewitness testimonies of groundskeepers, historians, photographers, and ordinary people who found themselves face to face with the supernatural among the tombstones. These are not fictional ghost stories, but real encounters reported by individuals who lived through experiences that defy explanation. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and locations have been altered, but the terror remains authentic. From midnight groundskeeper shifts that turned deadly to genealogy research that awakened sleeping spirits, these encounters will take you beyond the veil where Kentucky's restless dead continue their eternal vigil. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Nightmare Vault for daily true horror content that will chill you to the bone. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness beckons from beyond the grave. My name is Leo Vance, and I moved to Louisville from Houston back in 2019 to attend the University of Louisville. Like most college students, I was constantly broke and looking for any job that would pay decent money without interfering with my class schedule. That is how I ended up working the night shift as a groundskeeper at Calvary Cemetery, one of the oldest burial grounds in Louisville, dating back to 1846. The job seemed perfect at first. I worked from 1100 at night until 700 in the morning, Monday through Friday, which left my days free for classes. The pay was surprisingly good for what seemed like simple maintenance work. My supervisor, an older gentleman named Frank, who had been there for over 20 years, explained that most people did not want to work alone in a cemetery all night, which is why they paid a premium for the position. He laughed when he said it, but I noticed something in his eyes that suggested he was not entirely joking. The cemetery itself sprawled across nearly 40 acres of rolling hills, dotted with elaborate Victorian monuments, simple headstones, and family mausoleums that looked like miniature Gothic cathedrals. Ancient oak trees created a canopy so thick that even on bright moonlit nights, most of the grounds remained shrouded in darkness. My duties were straightforward enough: patrol the grounds for vandalism or trespassers, maintain the landscaping equipment, and handle any minor repairs that could not wait until morning. Frank gave me a golf cart to navigate the winding paths and a two-way radio to contact the security company if I encountered any problems. For the first 3 weeks, the job was everything I had hoped for. I would spend my nights listening to podcasts while trimming hedges, clearing fallen branches, or simply walking the peaceful grounds. The silence was profound in a way that city life never offered. Even the traffic from the nearby streets seemed muted and distant. I found myself enjoying the solitude and the strange beauty of the place at night. The elaborate sculptures and weathered headstones took on an almost mystical quality under the soft glow of my flashlight. The only odd thing I noticed during those early weeks was how quickly the temperature seemed to drop in certain sections of the cemetery. There were pockets of cold air that would hit you like walking into a freezer, even on warm September nights. The cold didn't just chill my skin, it felt like it sank into my bones, a damp, predatory cold. I assumed it had something to do with the way the hills and trees created microclimates, though I had never experienced anything quite like it before. These cold spots were not random, either. They consistently appeared in the same locations, near the oldest section of the cemetery where the headstones were so weathered you could barely read the names, around a particular mausoleum belonging to the Atherton family, and along a narrow path that led to an area Frank had specifically told me to avoid after midnight. When I asked him about that restriction during my 4th week, Frank became unusually serious. He explained that the back section of the cemetery, beyond the newer graves and past a grove of twisted cedar trees, was where they buried the indigent and unclaimed bodies in the early days. The graves there were unmarked, and the ground was uneven and potentially dangerous to navigate in the dark. He insisted it was purely a safety concern, but the way he avoided making eye contact when he spoke told me there was more to the story. It was on a Thursday night in early October when everything changed. I had been working my usual routine, starting with the eastern section of the cemetery and gradually making my way west. The night was unusually quiet, no wind to rustle the leaves, no distant sounds of traffic. Even the owls that normally provided a soundtrack to my nights were silent. The stillness was heavy, suffocating. As I approached the Atherton mausoleum around 2 in the morning, I encountered one of those familiar cold spots, but this time it was different. The temperature drop was so severe that my breath immediately became visible, and I could feel the cold penetrating through my heavy jacket. That was when I heard it for the first time. A soft, scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. I stopped walking and listened intently, trying to locate the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from inside the mausoleum itself. I approached the ornate iron gate that sealed the entrance and shone my flashlight through the bars. The beam illuminated marble walls and what appeared to be several stone coffins arranged within the chamber. Everything looked normal, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by what sounded like whispered voices. I convinced myself that it must be some kind of animal that had gotten trapped inside. Perhaps a raccoon or an opossum. I made a note to check with Frank in the morning about getting someone to investigate, but as I turned to walk away, the scratching stopped abruptly, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, clear as day, calling my name, not shouting, not urgent, just a calm, conversational tone saying, "Leo." As if someone was trying to get my attention. I spun around, expecting to see another person, perhaps a late-night visitor or someone from the security company making rounds. But I was completely alone. The silence had returned, thick and oppressive. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no response. I waited for several minutes, scanning the area with my flashlight and listening for any further sounds. When nothing else happened, I decided to continue my patrol, though I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps. The next night, I decided to start my rounds in a different section, hoping to avoid whatever had spooked me near the Atherton mausoleum. I began in the newer part of the cemetery, where the headstones were more modern and the paths were better maintained. Everything seemed normal until around 1:30 in the morning when I realized I was being followed. It started as just a feeling, that peculiar sensation of being watched that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But then I began to notice subtle signs. The sound of footsteps on gravel that would stop whenever I stopped. Shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees swaying in the breeze. And always those patches of impossibly cold air. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps there was another employee I had not been told about, or maybe the security company was conducting their own patrols. But when I radioed the dispatcher to ask if anyone else was supposed to be on the grounds, she confirmed that I was the only person scheduled to be there. She asked if I wanted someone to come check on me, but I declined, not wanting to seem paranoid or incapable of handling the job. By 3:00 in the morning, The sense of being followed had become so intense that I could no longer focus on my work. Every shadow seemed to conceal a figure. Every sound of settling leaves or creaking branches made me jump. I decided to return to the maintenance shed early and spend the rest of my shift doing paperwork and equipment checks. But as I drove the golf cart back along the main path, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes so hard I nearly fell out of the seat. Standing directly in front of me, perhaps 20 feet away, was a figure in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing. It was a woman, though I could not make out her face clearly in the darkness. She wore a long dress that seemed to flow and move despite the absence of any wind. Her hair was long and dark, and she stood perfectly still, as if she was waiting for something. I called out to her, asking if she needed help or if she was lost, but she did not respond. She just stood there, watching me. I reached for my flashlight to get a better look, but when I raised the beam to where she had been standing, there was nothing there. The path was completely empty. I sat in the golf cart for several minutes, my heart pounding, trying to process what I had just seen. I drove slowly to the spot where the figure had been standing and examined the ground carefully. There were no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The rest of that night passed without incident, but I could not shake the image of the woman in the old-fashioned dress. When I got home that morning, I spent hours researching the history of Calvary Cemetery online. I learned that it had been the final resting place for thousands of Louisville residents over more than a century and a half. Many of the oldest graves belonged to victims of cholera epidemics, yellow fever outbreaks, and other tragedies that had befallen the city in the 19th century. The descriptions I found of burial practices and funeral attire from that era matched what I had seen: long dresses, elaborate mourning clothes, and formal burial garments that would have been common for women of that time period. I considered quitting the job, but I needed the money too desperately. Instead, I decided to modify my approach. I would stick to the newer sections of the cemetery, avoid the areas where I had experienced the strange phenomena, and complete my shifts as quickly and efficiently as possible. For the next week, this strategy seemed to work. I encountered no more mysterious figures or unexplained sounds, though the cold spots remained, and I continued to feel watched whenever I ventured near the older sections. It was on the following Thursday night, exactly 2 weeks after my first supernatural encounter, that I had the experience that finally convinced me to find another job. I was completing my final patrol of the night around 600 in the morning, just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. I was driving past the section of the cemetery that Frank had warned me to avoid, the area where the indigent and unclaimed were buried, when the golf cart suddenly died. The engine simply cut out without warning, and all attempts to restart it failed. I was stranded about a quarter mile from the maintenance shed in the oldest and most isolated part of the cemetery. I had no choice but to walk back, but as I started down the path, I realized I was not alone. The woman in the old-fashioned dress was there again, but this time she was not standing in the distance. She was walking beside me, matching my pace exactly, staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Whenever I turned to look at her directly, she would fade away, but I could sense her presence constantly. As we walked together through the pre-dawn darkness, I began to hear other sounds around us. Footsteps on gravel, though I could see no one else. Whispered conversations in voices too faint to understand. The sound of crying, soft and mournful, coming from different directions. The temperature around me dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the grass beneath my feet, even though it was still early October and the night had been mild. But the most unnerving part of the experience was that I no longer felt afraid. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if I was experiencing the collective grief of everyone who had ever been laid to rest in that place. The woman beside me seemed to be trying to communicate something, though I could not understand what. When I finally reached the maintenance shed and looked back, she was gone, but I knew with absolute certainty that she had been guiding me safely through the darkness. I finished my shift that morning and never returned to Calvary Cemetery. I found a job waiting tables at a restaurant near campus, which paid less but allowed me to sleep through the nights. I never told Frank the real reason I was quitting, just said I needed something with different hours. But sometimes, even now, when I walk alone at night, I feel that familiar presence beside me, and I wonder if some connections transcend the boundaries between the living and the dead.
My name is Clara Evans, and I have dedicated the last 15 years of my career to genealogy research. It is not just a job for me, it is a calling that runs deeper than professional obligation. I spend countless hours researching family histories, digging through dusty archives, and visiting cemeteries across the country to uncover stories about people whose names might otherwise be forgotten forever. It is a profession that combines history, detective work, and a deep respect for those who came before us. What I experienced at Eastern Cemetery in Louisville changed everything I thought I knew about connecting with the past. The case that brought me to Kentucky began in the spring of 2022 when I was contacted by Alina Vance, an elderly woman from Portland who wanted to trace her maternal grandmother's family back to their Kentucky roots. Alina had grown up hearing fragments of stories about relatives who had settled in Louisville during the 1840s, but family records had been lost in a house fire decades earlier. She was particularly interested in finding the burial sites of her great-great-grandparents, Sean and Moira O'Connell, who had immigrated from Ireland and supposedly owned a small tobacco farm outside Louisville. I was immediately drawn to the project. Kentucky genealogy presented unique challenges due to incomplete records from the Civil War era and the complex migration patterns of early settlers. I spent 3 weeks preparing for my research trip, gathering what little documentation existed and mapping out the locations I would need to visit. Eastern Cemetery kept appearing in my research as the final resting place for many Irish immigrant families from that time period, making it an essential stop on my investigation. Eastern Cemetery, established in 1838, sprawled across nearly 300 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of Louisville. As I drove through the ornate iron gates on a gray October morning, I was struck by the sheer magnitude of the place. Thousands of headstones stretched across the landscape, ranging from elaborate Victorian monuments to simple stone markers that had weathered into near illegibility. The cemetery had that particular atmosphere that comes with age and accumulated sorrow, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything within its boundaries. I began my work systematically, starting with the newer sections and working my way back through time toward the oldest graves. My equipment was standard for genealogy fieldwork: a high-resolution digital camera for documenting headstones, a laptop loaded with genealogy software, detailed maps of the cemetery sections, and notebooks for recording information that could not be captured digitally. I had learned through years of experience to be thorough and methodical, as cemetery research often provided the only concrete evidence of a person's existence. The first few hours of my investigation proceeded normally. I located several graves belonging to Irish families who had arrived in Louisville during the same time period as the O'Connells, and I documented their headstones carefully. The information would help establish the broader context of Irish settlement patterns in the area. As I worked deeper into the older sections of the cemetery, I began to notice something peculiar that I had never encountered in 15 years of cemetery research. Many of the graves I was documenting had fresh wildflowers placed on them, despite showing no other signs of recent visitors. These were not the arranged bouquets typically left by family members, but simple gatherings of native Kentucky flowers that appeared to have been picked that very morning. The flowers were placed with care, not scattered randomly, and they appeared only on graves dating from the 1840s and 1850s. I made a note to ask the cemetery staff about volunteer groups that might be maintaining these older graves, though the randomness of which graves had flowers suggested it was not an organized effort. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the section of Eastern Cemetery where the O'Connell graves were most likely to be located. According to the burial records I had obtained from the Louisville Metro Archives, this area was significantly older and more overgrown than the sections I had been working in earlier. Many of the headstones were tilted at odd angles, and the paths between graves were barely visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. It was in this secluded area that I first began to experience what I can only describe as an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The temperature dropped noticeably as I moved deeper into this section, despite the fact that the October day had been mild and there was no wind to account for the sudden chill. More disturbing was the way sound seemed to be muffled here, as if the very air was thicker and more resistant to noise. I was photographing a particularly weathered headstone when I heard them for the first time, voices, speaking in what sounded like hushed conversation just at the edge of my hearing. The words were indistinct, but the cadence and tone were unmistakably human. I stopped working and listened intently, trying to locate the source of the voices. The cemetery appeared to be completely empty except for me, and the voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Initially, I attributed the phenomenon to acoustic effects created by the cemetery's topography, or perhaps distant conversations from the road that were being carried and distorted by the wind. However, as I continued my work, the voices became more frequent and seemed to follow me as I moved between graves. They were always just quiet enough that I could not make out individual words, but loud enough that I could not dismiss them as imagination. My electronic equipment began malfunctioning around 4:00 in the afternoon. My camera, which had been working perfectly all day, suddenly began displaying error messages and draining batteries at an alarming rate. I had brought spare batteries specifically for extended field work, but even fresh batteries would lose their charge within minutes of being installed. My laptop experienced similar problems, freezing repeatedly and displaying corrupted data that made no sense. The technical difficulties were frustrating, but what truly unnerved me was discovering that my handwritten notes were being altered. Pages in my notebook that I had written on earlier in the day showed signs of tampering. Words smeared as if touched by wet fingers, additional marks that I had not made, and in one case, an entire page that appeared to have been torn out and replaced with a blank sheet. I keep meticulous records of my work, and I know with absolute certainty that I had not made these changes. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself increasingly reluctant to venture into certain areas of the cemetery. There were spots where the oppressive atmosphere I had noticed earlier became almost unbearable, accompanied by a sensation that I was being watched from multiple directions. These feelings were strongest near a cluster of unmarked graves that, according to my research, likely contained the remains of Irish immigrants who had died during a cholera epidemic in 1849. It was near these unmarked graves that I experienced the most disturbing incident of my time at Eastern Cemetery. I was crouched beside a broken headstone, trying to make out the faded inscription, when I felt what could only be described as breath on the back of my neck. It was warm and moist, unmistakably human, and close enough that whoever was exhaling should have been touching me. I spun around immediately, expecting to find another person who had approached without my notice. But the path behind me was completely empty. The sensation of being breathed upon was so vivid and unmistakable that I spent several minutes examining the area around me, looking for any possible explanation. There were no other people visible anywhere in the cemetery, no animals that could account for the sensation, and no environmental factors that could have created the illusion of human breath. Yet the experience had been as real and physical as any human interaction. As evening approached, I decided to make one final attempt to locate the O'Connell family graves. According to the burial records, they should have been located in a section of the cemetery that had become heavily overgrown and was no longer accessible by the main paths. I gathered my remaining functional equipment and ventured into what was essentially wilderness within the cemetery boundaries. This area was unlike anything I had encountered in my genealogy work. The trees formed such a thick canopy that very little light reached the ground, creating an environment that felt more like a forest than a cemetery. The graves here were mostly unmarked or marked only with field stones, and the ground was uneven and treacherous. It was clear that this section had been abandoned by cemetery maintenance crews years, or possibly decades, earlier. It was in this forgotten corner of Eastern Cemetery that I finally found what I had been looking for. Partially hidden beneath fallen branches and overgrown with Virginia creeper, I discovered two headstones bearing the names Sean O'Connell and Moira O'Connell, along with dates that matched my research exactly. The stones were in poor condition but still legible, and I felt the satisfaction that comes with successfully completing a difficult genealogy puzzle. However, my moment of professional triumph was short-lived. As I knelt beside Moira O'Connell's grave to photograph the headstone, I heard a sound that I will never forget. A woman's voice, clear and distinct, speaking my name. Not shouting or calling out, but speaking conversationally as if she was standing right beside me and trying to get my attention. The voice said, "Clara," with the particular pronunciation and intonation that my grandmother had used when I was a child. I looked up from the camera and found myself staring into the face of a woman in a long gray dress who was standing not 10 feet away from me. She appeared to be middle-aged with dark hair pulled back severely and an expression of profound sadness. Her clothing was clearly from another era, with the high neckline and long sleeves typical of mid-19th century mourning attire. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we looked directly at each other. Then she was gone. Not walking away, not fading gradually, simply absent as if she had never been there at all. I stood up so quickly that I nearly fell backward over the headstone, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and disbelief. I examined the area where she had been standing and found no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands and began making my way back toward the main cemetery paths. But as I walked through the overgrown section, I realized that I was not alone. Shapes moved between the trees, always in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. The voices I had been hearing all day became more numerous and more distinct, though still impossible to understand. By the time I reached my car, full darkness had fallen, and I was in a state of near panic that I had never experienced before in my professional work. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, trying to process what I had experienced and decide whether I should report it to someone. But who would believe such an account from a genealogy researcher who was supposed to be dealing with facts and documentation? I completed Eleanor Vance's research project using the photographs and information I had gathered at Eastern Cemetery, but I never told her about the supernatural aspects of my visit. The O'Connell family graves were exactly where I had found them, and the documentation I provided allowed her to establish the connection to her Kentucky ancestors that she had been seeking. However, the experience changed my approach to genealogy research in fundamental ways. I no longer work alone in cemeteries, especially older ones, and I limit my visits to daylight hours whenever possible. More importantly, I have developed a deeper appreciation for the emotional connections that persist between families separated by death and time. I believe that what I encountered at Eastern Cemetery was evidence of those connections made manifest. The woman in the gray dress, whom I now believe was Moira O'Connell herself, was not trying to frighten me, but to ensure that her story and the stories of others buried in that forgotten section would not be lost to time. The fresh wildflowers that I had noticed throughout the day were not placed by living hands, but were tokens of remembrance from those whose memory keeps the dead alive. Genealogy research has always been about more than names and dates. It is about preserving the human stories that give meaning to our shared history. What I learned at Eastern Cemetery is that sometimes those we research are just as interested in preserving their stories as we are in discovering them.
My name is Julian Croft, and I am a photographer from Atlanta who specializes in Gothic and atmospheric imagery. Photography has always been more than just a profession for me. It is a way to explore the beauty hidden in darkness, to capture the interplay between shadow and light, and to tell the stories of places that most people hurry past without a second glance. For the past 6 years, I have been working on an ongoing project documenting historic cemeteries across the American South, drawn to their unique combination of natural beauty, architectural grandeur, and the profound sense of history that permeates these sacred spaces. When I began planning my senior portfolio for my Master of Fine Arts degree at the Savannah College of Art and Design, I knew that Kentucky would be an essential destination for my work. The state's historic cemeteries represent some of the most visually striking and emotionally powerful burial grounds in the country, with their elaborate Victorian monuments, ancient trees draped in Spanish moss, and the rolling hills that create dramatic natural backdrops for photography. I had spent months researching locations, studying historical records, and planning the technical aspects of shooting in low light conditions. Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville became the centerpiece of my Kentucky expedition. Established in 1848 and spanning 296 acres, Cave Hill is renowned not only for its historic significance, but also for its stunning landscape design and architectural elements. The cemetery serves as the final resting place for numerous notable figures, including Colonel Harland Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. But what drew me to Cave Hill was its reputation as one of the most photographically compelling cemeteries in the region. With its Gothic revival structures, elaborate mausoleums, and the ethereal quality of light that filters through the ancient oak and maple trees. I arrived at Cave Hill on a humid October evening, timing my visit to coincide with the new moon phase when ambient light would be at its minimum, allowing me to capture the subtle interplay of artificial lighting and natural moonlight that gives cemetery photography its distinctive atmospheric quality. My equipment for the evening included 2 DSLR camera bodies, a variety of lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, a sturdy carbon fiber tripod, portable LED lighting panels, and enough battery packs to sustain an all-night shooting session. The evening began perfectly. The weather was ideal for photography, with a light mist that added an otherworldly quality to the landscape without being so heavy as to interfere with visibility or equipment function. I started my work near the cemetery's main entrance, capturing the intricate stonework of the Gothic Revival archway and the imposing bronze gates that have welcomed visitors and mourners for over a century and a half. The architectural details were exceptional subjects for my Gothic aesthetic, with their combination of religious symbolism and Victorian funeral artistry. As midnight approached, I moved deeper into the older sections of Cave Hill, where the headstones and monuments date back to the cemetery's earliest years. This area fascinated me both as a photographer and as someone interested in historical preservation. Many of the graves belonged to families who had been instrumental in Louisville's development during the 19th century, and their elaborate monuments reflected both their social status and the funeral customs of their era. The craftsmanship was extraordinary: marble angels with faces worn smooth by more than a century of Kentucky weather, obelisks that towered 20 feet above the ground, and family mausoleums that resembled miniature Gothic cathedrals. It was in this historic section that I began experimenting with long exposure techniques, opening the camera shutter for extended periods to capture the subtle movement of mist through the cemetery, and the way moonlight created dramatic shadows among the monuments. Long exposure photography in cemeteries requires patience and technical precision, as the slightest camera movement during the exposure can ruin an image. I was particularly interested in capturing what photographers call light painting effects, where moving sources of illumination create streaks and patterns across the frame during the extended exposure time. During one particularly ambitious shot, I set up my camera to capture a 30-second exposure of a cluster of Victorian-era headstones surrounded by ancient oak trees. The composition was perfect: the interplay of organic and architectural forms, the dramatic contrast between the dark silhouettes of the trees and the pale limestone of the monuments, and the ethereal quality of the mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. When the exposure was complete, I reviewed the image on my camera's LCD screen, checking the focus and exposure settings to ensure I had captured what I intended. What I saw in that review changed everything about my night at Cave Hill Cemetery. In the background of the image, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a translucent figure that appeared to be standing behind one of the larger headstones. The figure had the shape and posture of a woman in a long dress, her outline soft and slightly luminous against the darker background of the cemetery. At first, I attributed the anomaly to a technical issue. Perhaps condensation on the lens, a reflection from one of my lighting panels, or some kind of digital artifact created by the long exposure process. Professional curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I moved my equipment closer to the location where the figure had appeared and carefully examined the area for any possible explanation for what I had captured. There were no reflective surfaces that could have created the effect, no sources of light that could have caused a lens flare, and no physical objects that could have been mistaken for a human form. I cleaned my lenses thoroughly and checked all my equipment settings, then set up for another series of long exposures in the same location. The results were even more disturbing. Not only did the translucent figure appear again, but this time it was accompanied by additional shapes that seemed to move between frames. By comparing sequential images, I could see that these forms were not static artifacts, but appeared to be moving through the cemetery in patterns that suggested purposeful behavior rather than random light phenomena. The shapes maintained consistent proportions and seemed to interact with the physical environment of the cemetery in ways that suggested they possessed some form of substance, even though they appeared translucent in the photographs. As my photography session continued past midnight, the phenomena intensified rather than diminished. I began capturing images that showed multiple figures simultaneously, sometimes appearing to gather around specific graves or monuments. The figures varied in size and apparent age, from what appeared to be children to adults, and their clothing suggested different historical periods spanning the entire history of the cemetery. Some wore the elaborate funeral attire typical of the Victorian era, while others appeared to be dressed in the simpler clothing of earlier periods. The most unnerving aspect of these photographs was that while I could see the figures clearly in my camera's images, I could not perceive them with my naked eye. Even when I was looking directly at locations where my camera was simultaneously capturing obvious supernatural manifestations, I saw nothing unusual. It was as if the camera was somehow sensitive to phenomena that existed beyond the normal range of human perception, recording images of activities that were occurring in a different dimensional space that overlapped with the physical cemetery. Around 100 in the morning, I decided to experiment with the audio recording capabilities of my camera equipment. Many modern DSLR cameras include high-quality microphones for video recording, and I was curious whether the audio might capture phenomena similar to what was appearing in my photographs. I set up my camera to record both video and audio while I continued taking still photographs, creating a comprehensive documentation of whatever was occurring at Cave Hill Cemetery. When I reviewed the audio recordings later, I discovered that my camera had indeed captured sounds that I had not heard during the actual recording session. The audio files contained what sounded like whispered conversations, though the words were too faint and distorted to understand clearly. There were also sounds that resembled sobbing, footsteps on gravel paths, and what might have been children playing in the distance. Most disturbing were moments when the audio seemed to capture someone saying my name, spoken in tones that ranged from conversational to urgent. The combination of visual and audio phenomena convinced me that I was documenting something far beyond the scope of my original artistic project. However, rather than fleeing from the situation, I found myself increasingly fascinated by the possibilities. As a photographer, I have always been drawn to subjects that challenge conventional understanding of reality, and I realized that I was potentially capturing evidence of phenomena that had been reported by others, but rarely documented with modern photographic equipment. I decided to focus my remaining time at Cave Hill on a specific area of the cemetery that seemed to generate the most intense supernatural activity. A section containing several family mausoleums dating from the 1870s and 1880s. These structures represented the pinnacle of Victorian funeral architecture, with their elaborate stonework, stained glass windows, and interior spaces designed to serve as eternal resting places for entire family lines. According to the historical research I had conducted before my visit, several of these mausoleums housed the remains of families who had experienced tragic losses, including multiple child deaths from epidemic diseases that had swept through Louisville during the late 19th century. As I set up my equipment near the Blackwood family mausoleum, which contained the remains of 5 children who had died during a diphtheria outbreak in 1882, I experienced the most intense supernatural encounter of my entire career as a photographer. The temperature around the mausoleum dropped so dramatically that my breath became visible, and frost began forming on my camera equipment, despite the fact that the October night had been mild and humid. The mist that had been drifting gently through the cemetery all evening began to swirl and concentrate around the mausoleum in patterns that defied the natural air currents. I began taking photographs as quickly as my equipment would allow, capturing frame after frame of the intensifying phenomena. The images showed not just the translucent figures I had been documenting throughout the evening, but what appeared to be a gathering of spirits around the mausoleum. The figures seemed to be interacting with each other and with the physical structure of the tomb, creating a scene that resembled a family reunion or some kind of commemoration taking place in a dimension that existed parallel to our physical reality. The climactic moment of the evening occurred when I was preparing for what I intended to be my final photograph of the night. I had set up an elaborate long-exposure shot that would capture the entire mausoleum complex, using multiple lighting angles to create dramatic shadows and highlight the architectural details. As I pressed the shutter release to begin the 30-second exposure, every piece of electronic equipment I had with me malfunctioned simultaneously. Camera flashes fired without being triggered. LCD screens flickered and displayed impossible images, and battery packs that had been fully charged moments earlier were suddenly completely drained. When I reviewed the final photograph the next morning, I discovered that my camera had captured something that still defies explanation. The image showed the mausoleum surrounded by dozens of translucent figures, adults and children alike, all clearly visible and appearing to pose deliberately for the photograph. Their faces, while ethereal and slightly blurred, conveyed a range of emotions from sorrow to peace to what might have been gratitude. Most remarkably, several of the figures appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if they were aware that they were being photographed and wanted to ensure that their presence was properly documented. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery fundamentally changed both my approach to photography and my understanding of the relationship between art and the supernatural. What had begun as a conventional fine art photography project had evolved into something that challenged the boundaries between documentation and spiritual exploration. The photographs I captured that night became the centerpiece of my master's thesis exhibition, though I presented them as artistic interpretations rather than claiming them as evidence of paranormal activity. Since that October evening, I have returned to Cave Hill Cemetery numerous times, always with respect for both the artistic possibilities and the spiritual significance of the place. Each visit has yielded additional photographs that document ongoing supernatural activity, though never again with the intensity of that first night. I have also expanded my cemetery photography project to include other locations where similar phenomena have been reported, creating a growing archive of images that suggest the boundaries between life and death are far more permeable than most people realize. The photographs from Cave Hill Cemetery have been exhibited in galleries across the Southeast and have attracted attention from both art critics and paranormal researchers. While I maintain my focus on the artistic merit of the work, I cannot deny that the images document phenomena that extend far beyond the realm of conventional photography. They serve as a bridge between the world of the living and whatever existence continues beyond physical death, captured through the unique perspective that only a camera lens can provide. My work has taught me that cemeteries are not simply repositories for the dead, but active spaces where memory, emotion, and perhaps consciousness itself continue to exist in forms that we are only beginning to understand. Through photography, I have been privileged to document evidence of this continuation, creating images that honor both the artistic tradition of Gothic photography and the profound mystery of what lies beyond the veil of death.
My name is Chloe Reed, and this story takes me back to when I was 17 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona. At that age, I thought I was invincible. I was the type of teenager who never backed down from a challenge, who thrived on proving that nothing could scare me. My friends and I were constantly daring each other to do increasingly reckless things, and I had built a reputation as the fearless one in our group, who would take on any challenge without hesitation. During our senior year of high school in 2021, our friend group had developed an obsession with urban exploration and what we called fear challenges. We would dare each other to spend time alone in supposedly haunted locations around Phoenix, abandoned buildings, old hospitals, and occasionally cemeteries. These adventures always happened at night, and we treated them like games, competing to see who could stay the longest in the scariest places. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous and disrespectful our behavior was. But at 17, I saw these challenges as the ultimate test of courage. The dare that changed everything came in mid-October, just 2 weeks before Halloween. I had mentioned to my friends that I would be spending Halloween week in Louisville, Kentucky, visiting my Aunt Sarah, who had moved there for work the previous year. The moment I told them about my travel plans, my best friend Maya's eyes lit up with mischief. She had been researching supposedly haunted locations across the country for her psychology class project on urban legends, and Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville had appeared on multiple lists as one of the most actively haunted cemeteries in America. The challenge she proposed was deceptively simple: spend exactly 1 hour alone in Cave Hill Cemetery after complete darkness had fallen, document my presence with photographs, and survive whatever supernatural encounters might occur. The rules were specific and non-negotiable. No flashlights or artificial lighting beyond my phone camera flash, no communication devices, no backup plans, and absolutely no leaving before the full hour had elapsed. To make it even more challenging, I would have to venture deep enough into the cemetery that I could not see the entrance or any street lights from my chosen location. When I arrived in Louisville, I spent the first few days of my visit researching Cave Hill Cemetery and planning my approach to the challenge. The cemetery, established in 1848, sprawled across 296 acres and served as the final resting place for over 120,000 people, including numerous notable figures from Kentucky history. What struck me most during my daytime reconnaissance visits was the sheer size and complexity of the place. Unlike the smaller, more manageable cemeteries I was familiar with in Phoenix, Cave Hill was like a small city of the dead, with winding roads, multiple sections representing different historical periods, and landscape features that created countless hidden areas where someone could easily become lost or disoriented. On Halloween night, I convinced my aunt that I was going to a party with some local friends I had met, which was partially true since I had connected with a few people through social media who were interested in Louisville's paranormal history. However, instead of attending any party, I drove to Cave Hill Cemetery at 9:30 in the evening, timing my arrival to ensure that full darkness would have settled over the grounds by the time I began my challenge. The October night was crisp and clear, with a thin crescent moon providing minimal illumination. As I approached the cemetery's main entrance, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had always accompanied these fear challenges. But there was something different about this experience from the beginning. Unlike the abandoned buildings and urban ruins I had explored in Phoenix, Cave Hill possessed an atmosphere of profound solemnity and accumulated sorrow that seemed to press against me like a physical weight. I entered through a gap in the perimeter fence rather than using the main gates, which were locked after sunset, and began making my way toward the center of the cemetery where the oldest monuments and mausoleums were located. My chosen destination was an area known as the Victorian section, where elaborate 19th-century family tombs created a landscape that resembled a miniature city of marble and granite structures. This area was far enough from any perimeter lighting to ensure complete darkness, and the density of monuments would provide interesting photographic subjects for my documentation requirements. The first 20 minutes of my hour-long challenge passed without incident, though I was immediately struck by the intensity of the silence that enveloped the cemetery after dark. Unlike the urban environment I was accustomed to in Phoenix, where there was always background noise from traffic, air conditioning units, and human activity, Cave Hill at night was profoundly quiet in a way that made every small sound seem amplified and significant. The occasional rustle of leaves or distant sound of traffic seemed to come from another world entirely. I spent the initial portion of my time taking photographs of various monuments and mausoleums, using my phone's camera flash to illuminate the elaborate Victorian funeral architecture. The dramatic interplay of light and shadow created by the sudden flash in the surrounding darkness produced some genuinely striking images, and I began to think that my friend's challenge might result in some impressive photographic documentation that would prove my fearlessness while also creating memorable artistic images. However, as I moved deeper into the Victorian section and farther from any external light sources, I began to experience phenomena that challenged my skeptical rationalism and tested my resolve to complete the full IOR. The first unusual occurrence was a gradual but noticeable drop in temperature that seemed to be localized around certain specific monuments. These cold spots were not uniform or explainable by normal environmental factors like elevation or wind patterns, but appeared to be concentrated around particular graves in ways that suggested they were somehow emanating from the burial sites themselves. More disturbing were the sounds that began around the 30-minute mark of my challenge. What started as barely perceptible whispers gradually became more distinct and seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The voices were too faint to understand clearly, but they had the unmistakable cadence and intonation of human conversation, as if groups of people were having quiet discussions just beyond the range of my hearing. When I tried to approach the sources of these sounds, they would fade away, only to resume from different locations moments later. The psychological impact of these phenomena was more intense than I had anticipated. Unlike the straightforward fear I had experienced during previous challenges in abandoned buildings, where the threat felt concrete and manageable, the supernatural atmosphere of Cave Hill created a sense of unease that seemed to penetrate to a much deeper level of consciousness. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the shadows between monuments, and questioning whether the shapes I was seeing in my peripheral vision were tricks of light or something more substantial. At approximately 45 minutes into my challenge, I experienced the encounter that would haunt me for years afterward. I was photographing an elaborate family mausoleum belonging to the Atherton family when I heard my name being called in a voice that was unmistakably female but carried an otherworldly quality that made my blood freeze. The voice was not shouting or urgent, but spoke my name with a gentle insistence that suggested familiarity, as if whoever was calling knew me personally and was trying to get my attention for an important reason. I called out in response, asking who was there and whether someone needed help, but received no answer. Instead, the temperature around me plummeted so dramatically that my breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and a mist began to rise from the ground around the Atherton mausoleum. The mist moved in patterns that defied the natural air currents, swirling and concentrating in ways that seemed purposeful rather than random. It was within this supernatural mist that I saw her, a figure in white that appeared to be a young woman wearing what looked like a Victorian-era dress. She stood approximately 30 feet away from me near a cluster of smaller headstones that marked the graves of children who had died during a diphtheria epidemic in the 1880s. The figure was translucent but clearly defined, with long dark hair that moved as if stirred by an unfelt breeze and eyes that seemed to be looking directly at me with an expression of profound sadness. For several moments that seemed to stretch into eternity, we regarded each other across the misty cemetery landscape. She raised one arm and pointed toward a small, unmarked grave behind me, then began to mouth words that I could not hear but somehow understood. She was trying to tell me something about the children buried in that section, something about their deaths and the grief that had never fully been laid to rest. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but its emotional impact was overwhelming. I felt flooded with a sorrow that was not my own, experiencing what seemed to be the accumulated grief of generations of parents who had lost children, families who had been torn apart by disease and tragedy, and individuals who had died far from home and loved ones. The intensity of these emotions was so powerful that I found myself weeping uncontrollably, though I could not explain why. When the apparition finally faded away, dissolving gradually into the mist until nothing remained but the normal darkness of the cemetery, I was left trembling and emotionally exhausted. I completed the remaining few minutes of my hour-long challenge huddled against the cold stone of the Atherton Mausoleum, no longer interested in taking photographs or proving my bravery, but simply trying to process what I had experienced and maintain my composure until I could leave. The photographs I captured that night contain anomalies that I have never been able to explain. Several images show unexplained lights and shadows that were not visible to my naked eye during the actual photography session. Others display what appear to be translucent human figures in the background, though they are so faint that they might be dismissed as pareidolia or photographic artifacts by someone predisposed to skepticism. Most significantly, one photograph taken near the children's graves clearly shows the figure in white that I encountered, though she appears even more ethereal in the image than she did during the actual sighting. The photograph has been examined by several people with expertise in digital photography, and none have been able to identify any technical explanation for the anomalous figure that appears in the image. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery fundamentally changed my relationship with fear, death, and the supernatural. I returned to Phoenix a different person than I had been when I left, no longer interested in proving my fearlessness through reckless challenges, but deeply aware that there are aspects of existence that extend far beyond our normal understanding of reality. The encounter taught me that some places hold accumulated emotional energy that can manifest in ways that transcend the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead. I have never participated in another fear challenge since that Halloween night, and I have never returned to Cave Hill Cemetery despite having visited Louisville several times in subsequent years. The memory of that encounter remains vivid and emotionally powerful, serving as a constant reminder that respect for the dead and for places of mourning is not just a matter of social convention, but of spiritual necessity. When my friends ask me about that night and whether I successfully completed their challenge, I tell them that I did spend the full hour alone in Cave Hill Cemetery. But I also explain that some experiences change you in ways that make the original motivation for seeking them seem trivial and immature. I learned that true courage is not about proving you are unafraid, but about being willing to face the unknown with respect and humility, even when it challenges everything you thought you understood about the world.
My name is Professor Alastair Finch, and I teach American history at Boston University with a specialization in Civil War studies. Over the past 30 years, I have dedicated my academic career to researching and documenting the experiences of soldiers and civilians during America's most devastating conflict. My work has taken me to battlefields, archives, and cemeteries throughout the South and Midwest, but nothing in my extensive research prepared me for what I discovered at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, during the winter of 2022. I had traveled to Louisville as part of a larger research project examining the burial practices and memorialization of Civil War soldiers in border states. Kentucky's unique position during the war, officially neutral but providing soldiers to both Union and Confederate armies, created fascinating complexities in how the dead from both sides were honored and remembered. Cave Hill Cemetery, established in 1848, housed nearly 6,000 Civil War veterans from both armies, making it an invaluable resource for understanding how communities dealt with the aftermath of a war that literally divided families and neighborhoods. The cemetery's Civil War section spanned several acres in the older portion of the grounds, with graves arranged in military precision that reflects the martial nature of their occupants' service. Union soldiers are buried in one area, Confederate soldiers in another, yet the proximity of these burial sections creates a poignant reminder of how young men who might have faced each other across battlefields now rest mere yards apart in death. The headstones themselves tell stories of tremendous loss, entire companies decimated by disease, young men who died far from home, and officers whose military careers ended in muddy fields across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. My research methodology typically involves spending several days at each location, photographing headstones, transcribing inscriptions, and cross-referencing burial records with military service documents. I work systematically, moving through cemetery sections while maintaining detailed notes about burial patterns, monument styles, and any historical significance of particular graves. This methodical approach has served me well throughout my career, allowing me to publish several well-regarded academic papers on Civil War memorial practices and their evolution over time. However, Cave Hill Cemetery presented challenges that extended far beyond normal historical research. From my first day working in the Civil War section, I noticed atmospheric conditions that seemed inconsistent with normal weather patterns. Despite visiting during a typically mild Kentucky January, certain areas of the cemetery experienced sudden temperature drops that were severe enough to make my breath visible and cause frost to form on my equipment. These cold spots were not randomly distributed, but seemed to be concentrated around specific graves, particularly those belonging to soldiers who had died in battle rather than from disease or injury in military hospitals. More puzzling were the sounds that began occurring during my second day of research. While examining headstones in the Confederate section, I began hearing what sounded like distant drumming, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from no identifiable source. The sound was too regular and sustained to be construction work or traffic, and it seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than from any external location. When I asked cemetery staff about possible renovation work or nearby construction that might account for the noise, they confirmed that no such activities were taking place anywhere in the vicinity. The drumming sounds were accompanied by what I can only describe as the distant murmur of human voices, though the words were indistinguishable and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. As a historian accustomed to working alone in quiet archives and libraries, I initially attributed these phenomena to the acoustic properties of the cemetery's landscape, or perhaps my imagination working overtime in the solemn environment. However, as the sounds persisted and became more distinct, I could no longer dismiss them as environmental factors or psychological suggestion. On the third day of my research, while documenting graves in the section reserved for Union soldiers, I experienced my first visual manifestation of whatever supernatural forces were active in Cave Hill Cemetery. I was photographing the headstone of a young private from the 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiment who had died at the Battle of Stones River, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. When I looked up from my camera, I saw a figure in what appeared to be a Civil War-era military uniform standing approximately 50 yards away near a cluster of graves belonging to members of the same regiment. The figure was translucent but clearly defined, wearing the dark blue uniform and kepi cap typical of Union infantry soldiers. He stood at attention as if on guard duty, facing toward the Confederate section of the cemetery. Most remarkably, he appeared to be a young man, probably no older than 20, with a lean build and serious expression that I had seen in countless Civil War-era photographs. For several minutes, we regarded each other across the cemetery landscape, and I had the distinct impression that he was as aware of my presence as I was of his. When I attempted to approach the figure, he faded gradually until nothing remained but the normal winter landscape of the cemetery. However, this encounter marked the beginning of increasingly frequent and intense supernatural experiences that would transform my understanding of historical research and the relationship between past and present. Over the following days, I began to see multiple figures throughout the Civil War section, always appearing during daylight hours when I was actively conducting research. They wore uniforms from both armies and appeared to be of various ages and ranks, from young drummer boys to grizzled sergeants with weather-beaten faces that spoke of long campaigns and hard service. Most appeared to be going about military duties, standing guard, marching in formation, or simply observing the cemetery grounds with the alert attention of soldiers on duty. What struck me most about these apparitions was their apparent awareness of each other, and their seeming indifference to the political divisions that had defined their mortal lives. I observed Union and Confederate soldiers occupying the same spaces, sometimes appearing to interact with each other in ways that suggested camaraderie rather than enmity. This supernatural reconciliation was deeply moving to witness, representing a healing that transcended the bitter divisions that had torn the nation apart during their lifetimes. The most extraordinary encounter occurred during my final day of research at Cave Hill Cemetery. I was completing my documentation of a section containing graves of soldiers who had died at the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky's most significant Civil War engagement, when I heard the unmistakable sound of marching feet approaching across the cemetery grounds. The sound grew louder and more distinct, accompanied by the jangle of equipment and the low murmur of men talking among themselves, as soldiers do during long marches. I looked up from my work to see an entire company of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, marching in loose formation along the cemetery's main pathway. They appeared to be heading toward the center of the Civil War section, where a large memorial monument commemorates all the soldiers buried in Cave Hill, regardless of their allegiance. The procession included soldiers of all ages and ranks, some carrying rifles, others bearing regimental flags that hung limp in the still winter air. As they passed near my location, several of the soldiers turned to look at me directly, acknowledging my presence with nods or slight salutes. One figure, an officer wearing the insignia of a Union colonel, broke away from the formation and approached me. He was a middle-aged man with a full beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, his voice was clear but seemed to come from a great distance, as if he was calling across a vast space. He told me that they appreciated my work in preserving their stories and ensuring that their service and sacrifice were remembered by future generations. He explained that they had been waiting for someone who would understand the importance of their experience and could communicate their message to the living world. The war that had divided them in life, he said, had been resolved in death, and they now stood together as brothers who had served their country according to their conscience and the circumstances of their time. The colonel asked me to convey to others that the animosity and hatred that had characterized the Civil War period had been transformed into mutual respect and understanding. The soldiers buried at Cave Hill, regardless of the color of their uniforms, were united in their desire to be remembered not as enemies, but as young men who had answered their nation's call to service, even when that call led them to fight against fellow Americans who shared their fundamental values and aspirations. This message, delivered by a supernatural messenger in a Louisville cemetery, profoundly changed my approach to Civil War history. I realized that my academic focus on military strategy, political causes, and statistical analysis had overlooked the essentially human dimension of the conflict, the shared experience of young men thrust into circumstances beyond their control, fighting for causes they may not have fully understood, but united by their commitment to duty and their love for the country they served. When the colonel finished speaking, he saluted me formally and rejoined the formation, which continued its march toward the central memorial. I watched until the entire procession faded from view, leaving me alone among the headstones with a sense of having witnessed something sacred and historically significant. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery led me to publish a paper titled Reconciliation Beyond the Grave: Supernatural Encounters and Historical Understanding in the Journal of American History. Though I presented the supernatural elements as metaphorical rather than literal experiences, the paper argued for a more humanistic approach to Civil War studies that emphasizes the shared experiences and eventual reconciliation of Americans who were temporarily divided by political and regional differences. However, the true significance of my encounter at Cave Hill extends beyond academic scholarship. It demonstrated that historical research is not simply about documenting facts and analyzing data, but about connecting with the human experiences that give meaning to historical events. The soldiers I encountered in that Louisville cemetery were not abstract historical figures, but real individuals whose stories continue to resonate across the centuries, seeking recognition and understanding from those of us who have inherited the nation they helped preserve. Since that winter day in 2022, I have returned to Cave Hill Cemetery several times, always hoping to encounter the soldiers again. While I have not experienced manifestations as dramatic as that initial research trip, I continue to sense their presence among the headstones, standing eternal guard over the memory of their service, and the lessons their experiences can teach us about duty, sacrifice, and the possibility of reconciliation even after the most bitter conflicts. My work at Cave Hill Cemetery taught me that history is not confined to books and archives, but lives on in the places where significant events occurred, and in the spirits of those who participated in shaping our national story. The Civil War soldiers buried in that Louisville cemetery represent more than statistical casualties or strategic assets. They are individual human beings whose experiences continue to speak to us across time, offering wisdom about the cost of division and the possibility of healing. This understanding has transformed my teaching and research, leading me to emphasize the personal dimensions of historical events, and to encourage my students to see history not as a series of abstract concepts, but as the accumulated experience of real people who faced challenges similar to those we encounter today. The lessons learned from my supernatural encounters at Cave Hill Cemetery have made me a better historian and a more complete human being, demonstrating that the boundaries between past and present are far more permeable than most people realize.
My name is Deanne Miller, and I have been a volunteer with the Pacific Northwest Historical Preservation Society for over 12 years. I live in Seattle, Washington, but my work with gravestone restoration has taken me across the United States to preserve neglected cemeteries and repair damaged headstones that serve as the last remaining records of countless forgotten lives. Our organization operates on the principle that these stone monuments are not merely markers of death, but vital connections to history that deserve preservation for future generations who seek to understand their heritage and the experiences of those who came before them. In the autumn of 2022, our restoration team received a request from the Kentucky Historical Society to assist with a project at Fairview Cemetery, a small rural burial ground located approximately 15 miles southeast of Bowling Green. The cemetery, established in 1823 by the founding families of what was then a frontier settlement, had fallen into severe disrepair over the past several decades. Many headstones had been toppled by storms, broken by vandalism, or simply succumbed to the relentless effects of Kentucky weather and neglect. The local community lacked the resources and expertise necessary to properly restore the cemetery, but they were determined to preserve the final resting place of their ancestors. Our team consisted of 8 volunteers with diverse backgrounds and skill sets essential for comprehensive cemetery restoration. I served as the project coordinator, drawing on my experience in historical preservation and my background in art history. Bob Shaw, a retired carpenter from Lexington, brought expertise in stonemasonry and structural repair. Dr. Lena Petrova, an archaeology graduate student from the University of Kentucky, provided knowledge of proper excavation techniques and historical documentation. The remaining team members included a retired librarian who specialized in genealogy research, 2 experienced stoneworkers, a photographer who documented our progress, and a local historian who served as our liaison with the Bowling Green community. When our team arrived at Fairview Cemetery on a crisp October morning, we immediately understood why the local community had sought professional assistance. The cemetery occupied approximately 3 acres of rolling Kentucky hills, surrounded by mature oak and maple trees that created a natural boundary between the burial ground and the surrounding farmland. However, decades of neglect had allowed invasive vegetation to overrun much of the site, and many headstones were either completely obscured by undergrowth or had been displaced from their original positions by root growth and soil erosion. The cemetery contained graves spanning nearly 2 centuries of local history, from the original pioneer families who had settled the area in the 1820s through residents who had died as recently as the 1990s. The oldest section, where we would focus most of our restoration efforts, contained approximately 60 graves belonging to the founding families and their descendants, including several veterans of the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and both sides of the Civil War. Many of these early headstones were crafted from local limestone that had weathered beautifully, but had also proven vulnerable to acid rain and biological growth that obscured their inscriptions. Our restoration methodology followed established preservation protocols developed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We began each day by carefully documenting the existing condition of headstones through photography and detailed written assessments. Next, we would gently clean accumulated dirt, lichen, and biological matter using specialized tools and cleaning solutions that would not damage the original stone. When necessary, we would reset fallen stones using appropriate materials and techniques that maintained historical authenticity while ensuring long-term stability. During our first day of work, I was assigned to restore a cluster of graves in the oldest section of the cemetery, where the original pioneer families had been buried beneath simple limestone markers that bore minimal decoration but contained essential genealogical information. Working alongside Bob and Lena, I began the meticulous process of clearing decades of accumulated debris from around the headstones and carefully cleaning their surfaces to reveal the faded but still legible inscriptions carved into the stone. The work was physically demanding but spiritually rewarding, as each cleaned headstone revealed the name and dates of someone whose life had contributed to the development of the local community. We uncovered graves belonging to farmers, craftsmen, mothers who had died in childbirth, and children who had succumbed to the diseases that swept through frontier settlements with devastating regularity. Each inscription told a story of hardship, loss, and the determination of people who had chosen to build their lives in what was then considered the western frontier of American civilization. However, as we worked deeper into the restoration project, our team began experiencing phenomena that challenged our scientific approach to historical preservation. The first unusual occurrence happened during our second day when I heard distinct footsteps walking behind me while I was kneeling beside a particularly weathered headstone belonging to Martha Coleman, who had died in 1847 at the age of 24. When I turned to see which team member was approaching, I found that I was completely alone in that section of the cemetery, and the nearest volunteer was working more than 50 yards away. Initially, I attributed the phenomenon to the acoustic properties of the cemetery environment, or perhaps my imagination being influenced by the solemn atmosphere of our work. However, similar experiences began occurring with increasing frequency for multiple team members. Lena reported feeling as though she was being watched while working alone near a massive oak tree that shaded several Civil War-era graves, and Bob mentioned hearing faint conversations in voices too distant to understand clearly. These supernatural encounters intensified as our work progressed, and we became more deeply involved in the restoration of individual graves. During our third day at Fairview Cemetery, while carefully cleaning the headstone of Ezekiel Morrison, a War of 1812 veteran who had died in 1852, I experienced the most profound supernatural encounter of my career in historical preservation. As I was gently scraping lichen from the carved inscription on Morrison's headstone, I felt a sudden and dramatic drop in temperature that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath me. The cold was so intense that my breath immediately became visible in the previously mild October air, and frost began forming on the metal tools I was using for the restoration work. Simultaneously, I felt what could only be described as a gentle but unmistakable pressure on my shoulder, as if someone was placing their hand there in a gesture of appreciation or encouragement. When I looked up from my work, I saw a translucent figure standing approximately 10 feet away from me near a cluster of children's graves that we had not yet begun to restore. The figure appeared to be a woman in her 30s wearing a long dress with intricate lace detailing typical of mid-19th century fashion. Her hair was arranged in the elaborate style popular during the 1840s and 1850s, and her overall appearance suggested someone from the same historical period as the graves we were restoring. What struck me most about this apparition was the expression of profound gratitude and peace on her face. She was looking directly at me with eyes that conveyed both sadness for her separation from the living world and appreciation for the work we were doing to preserve the memory of those buried in Fairview Cemetery. We maintained eye contact for what seemed like several minutes, though time felt strangely distorted during the encounter. The spirit then gestured toward the children's graves with a movement that clearly indicated her concern for their condition and her desire to see them properly restored. I understood intuitively that she was the mother of some of the children buried in that section, and that she had been waiting for someone to show proper care and respect for their final resting place. Her presence communicated a message that transcended verbal language. These graves represented not just historical artifacts, but the final earthly connection to beloved family members whose memories deserve to be preserved and honored. As the apparition began to fade from view, dissolving gradually into the autumn mist that had begun to rise from the cemetery grounds, I felt overwhelmed by an emotion that was not entirely my own. I experienced what seemed to be her maternal love and concern for the children buried nearby, as well as her gratitude for our restoration efforts, and her relief that their graves would finally receive proper care. That evening, when I reviewed the photographs I had taken during the day's work, I discovered that one image captured what appeared to be a faint, luminous outline in the area where I had seen the spirit. The photograph showed an indistinct but unmistakably human-shaped form standing near the children's graves, though the figure was so ethereal that it could easily be dismissed as a photographic anomaly by anyone predisposed to skeptical interpretation. The supernatural encounter fundamentally changed my approach to the remaining restoration work at Fairview Cemetery. Rather than viewing our project simply as historical preservation, I began to understand it as a form of communion with the deceased that honored their memory and acknowledged their continued spiritual connection to the physical world. This perspective enhanced the meaning and purpose of our work, transforming routine restoration tasks into acts of reverence that recognized the humanity of those whose graves we were preserving. Over the following days, other team members reported their own supernatural experiences that reinforced my growing conviction that our restoration work was serving purposes beyond historical preservation. Bob discovered that his tools would occasionally be moved overnight, always in ways that suggested someone was trying to help with the restoration process rather than hinder it. Lena found fresh wildflowers placed on graves that we had recently cleaned, though no living person could have accessed the cemetery during the night hours when the flowers appeared. Most significantly, our team began working with an efficiency and coordination that seemed to exceed our normal capabilities, as if we were receiving guidance from unseen sources who understood the cemetery's layout and the specific needs of each grave. We completed the restoration project several days ahead of schedule, achieving results that surpassed our initial expectations and earned recognition from the Kentucky Historical Society for the quality and thoroughness of our work. The experience at Fairview Cemetery taught me that gravestone restoration involves more than preserving physical artifacts or maintaining historical records. It represents a form of communication between the living and the dead that acknowledges the continuing spiritual presence of those who have passed away, while ensuring that their earthly monuments remain intact for future generations. The supernatural encounters we experienced during our work confirmed that proper respect and care for burial sites can create connections that transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. Since returning to Seattle, I have maintained correspondence with several team members who participated in the Fairview Cemetery project, and we continue to share experiences and insights that have deepened our understanding of historical preservation as a spiritual practice. Our success at Fairview led to additional restoration projects throughout Kentucky and other states, where rural cemeteries require professional attention to prevent the permanent loss of irreplaceable historical records. The restoration work has also influenced my personal spiritual beliefs, leading me to develop a deeper appreciation for the ways in which memory, love, and respect can create lasting connections between generations. I have come to understand that cemeteries serve not only as repositories for the dead, but as sacred spaces where the living can maintain relationships with departed loved ones through acts of remembrance and care. My experience with gravestone restoration has taught me that preservation work serves multiple constituencies: the historical community that depends on physical records to understand the past, the genealogical researchers who seek information about their ancestors, and the spirits of the deceased who continue to care about how they are remembered and honored. The supernatural encounters at Fairview Cemetery demonstrated that these spiritual concerns are not merely abstract concepts, but represent active forces that can influence and guide preservation efforts when they are undertaken with proper respect and intention. To anyone considering involvement in cemetery restoration or historical preservation work, I would emphasize that such projects offer opportunities for profound personal growth and spiritual development that extend far beyond the technical skills involved in cleaning headstones or repairing damaged monuments. The work creates connections with the past that can fundamentally change your understanding of mortality, memory, and the enduring power of human love to transcend the boundaries of death. The restoration of Fairview Cemetery stands as one of the most meaningful accomplishments of my preservation career, not only because of the historical records we saved from deterioration, but because of the spiritual connections we forged with those whose memory we were privileged to preserve. The experience confirmed my belief that proper care for burial sites represents one of the most fundamental expressions of human respect for the dignity and continuing significance of every individual life, regardless of how many years may have passed since that life ended.
My name is Sam Carter, and I am from Denver, Colorado. In the summer of 2023, I was driving through rural Kentucky on my way to visit family in Tennessee when I encountered something that still defies my understanding of reality. What started as a simple navigation error turned into the most frightening yet profound experience of my life, involving supernatural guidance from the residents of a forgotten cemetery, whose compassion extended far beyond death. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours when I found myself completely lost somewhere in the backwoods of southeastern Kentucky. My GPS had lost signal about 30 miles back, and my cell phone showed no service bars. The rural roads I was traveling seemed to wind endlessly through dense forests and rolling hills, with no signs of civilization or even road markers to indicate where I might be. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the narrow asphalt road, and I was starting to feel the first hints of genuine panic about my situation. The problem had started when I decided to take what appeared to be a scenic detour off Interstate 75, hoping to avoid heavy traffic around Lexington and see some of the beautiful Kentucky countryside I had heard so much about. What had seemed like a simple alternate route had quickly evolved into a maze of increasingly smaller roads that seemed to lead deeper into wilderness rather than toward any recognizable destination. After 2 hours of driving through rural Kentucky, without seeing another vehicle or any indication that I was heading in the right direction, I realized that my decision to leave the interstate had been a serious mistake. As darkness began to fall, I spotted what appeared to be a small church ahead, its white steeple barely visible through the trees in the fading light. I felt a surge of relief, thinking that I could ask for directions and possibly use a phone to call my family and let them know about the delay. However, as I pulled into what I thought was a church parking lot, I discovered that the building was actually an abandoned chapel with boarded windows and obvious signs of long neglect. More disturbing was the realization that I had not pulled into a church parking lot at all, but into the entrance of an old cemetery that extended behind the ruined chapel into the surrounding woods. The cemetery appeared to be very old, with headstones dating back to the 1800s and possibly earlier. Many of the monuments were tilted at odd angles or had fallen over completely, and the entire area was overgrown with vegetation. This suggested it had been abandoned for many years. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The abandoned cemetery was certainly not the kind of place where I wanted to spend the night, but I was running low on gasoline and had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. My phone still showed no signal, and the GPS remained completely non-functional. The silence was profound in a way that only exists in truly remote locations, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional call of nocturnal birds beginning their evening activities. Just as I was preparing to continue driving in hopes of finding someone who could provide directions, I noticed movement among the headstones. At first, I attributed it to my imagination or perhaps small animals moving through the cemetery, but the movement seemed too deliberate and coordinated to be explained by wildlife. As I watched more carefully, I began to see what appeared to be human figures walking slowly among the graves, though they seemed translucent and luminous in a way that was clearly not normal. My rational mind insisted that I was experiencing hallucinations brought on by stress and fatigue, but the figures became more distinct as I continued to observe them. They appeared to be people from different historical periods, dressed in clothing that ranged from simple frontier garments to more elaborate Victorian-era attire. Some appeared to be elderly, while others seemed quite young, and they moved through the cemetery with purpose rather than the aimless wandering I might have expected from supernatural apparitions. One of the figures, an older man wearing what appeared to be a Civil War-era uniform, began walking toward my car. As he approached, I could see that while he was clearly translucent, his features were distinct, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership and responsibility. When he reached the driver's side window, he gestured for me to roll it down, which I did despite my fear and confusion about what was happening. The spirit spoke in a voice that was clear but seemed to come from a great distance, as if he was calling across a vast space. He told me that they had been expecting me, and that they understood I was lost and needed assistance finding my way back to the main highway. He explained that many travelers had become lost on these rural roads over the years, and that he and the other residents of the cemetery had developed a system for helping people find their way back to safety. He introduced himself as Colonel John Maxwell, who had served in the Union Army during the Civil War and had settled in this area after the war ended. He had died in 1897 and had been buried in the cemetery along with his wife and several of his children who had died young. He told me that the chapel had once served a small farming community that had thrived in the late 1800s, but had gradually been abandoned as younger generations moved to larger towns and cities. Colonel Maxwell explained that the spirits in the cemetery had observed many lost travelers over the decades, and learned that they could sometimes manifest strongly enough to provide guidance to living people who needed assistance. He assured me that they meant no harm and simply wanted to help me reach safety before full darkness made driving on the unfamiliar roads even more dangerous. He pointed toward a dirt road that led away from the cemetery in a direction I had not previously considered, explaining that it would eventually connect with a paved county road that would take me back to Interstate 75. However, he warned me that the route was complex, and that I would need guidance to navigate the numerous turns and intersections correctly. He asked if I would be willing to accept help from one of the cemetery residents who would accompany me to ensure that I did not become lost again. Despite my fear and disbelief about what was happening, I was desperate enough to accept any assistance that might help me escape my predicament. Colonel Maxwell gestured toward a young woman who had been standing near a cluster of family graves, and she began walking toward my car. She appeared to be in her 20s, wearing a simple dress typical of the early 1900s, and her expression conveyed kindness and concern for my situation. She introduced herself as Emily Carter explaining that she had died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic that had claimed many lives in rural Kentucky. She told me that she had been helping lost travelers for many years and was familiar with all the back roads in the area. She asked if she could ride with me to provide directions, assuring me that I would not be able to see or hear her once we left the cemetery grounds, but that she would find ways to guide me nonetheless. I agreed to her assistance, though I had no idea what to expect from a supernatural traveling companion. Emily approached the passenger side of my car and seemed to settle into the seat, though I could not feel any change in the vehicle's weight or balance. She told me to begin driving toward the dirt road that Colonel Maxwell had indicated and assured me that she would find ways to communicate the directions I needed to follow. As we left the cemetery and began driving along the dirt road, Emily's visible form gradually faded until I could no longer see her at all. However, I immediately began experiencing what I can only describe as intuitive knowledge about which direction to turn at each intersection. At every fork in the road or junction with other paths, I found myself inexplicably certain about which route to take. Even though I had never traveled these roads before and had no logical basis for making such decisions. The guidance continued for nearly an hour as we navigated through a complex network of rural roads that wound through forests, farmland, and small communities that seemed frozen in time. Several times I felt compelled to stop the car when the road ahead was blocked by fallen trees or washed-out bridges, only to discover alternate routes that I would never have noticed without supernatural assistance. Most remarkably, I began to sense Emily's presence and personality despite being unable to see or hear her directly. I felt her patient kindness and her genuine concern for my safety, as well as her knowledge of the local area and her familiarity with the challenges that travelers faced on these remote roads. At one point, when I was beginning to doubt the directions I was receiving, I felt what seemed like a gentle touch on my shoulder and experienced a surge of confidence and reassurance that convinced me to continue following the intuitive guidance. Eventually, we emerged onto a paved county road that I recognized from my earlier travels, and I knew that I was only a few miles from the interstate highway that would take me back to my original route. As soon as I reached the familiar road, the supernatural guidance ceased, and I felt Emily's presence fade away completely. I was once again alone in my car, but I was no longer lost and could easily find my way back to the main highway. Before continuing on my journey, I pulled over at the first gas station I encountered and asked the attendant about the cemetery where I had received assistance. He told me that the old cemetery near the abandoned chapel had been serving the local community since the 1840s and contained the graves of many of the area's original settlers, including several Civil War veterans. He mentioned that local people sometimes reported strange lights and unexplained phenomena in the area, though most attributed such stories to folklore and imagination. When I described my experience to the attendant, he became very serious and told me that I was not the first traveler to report receiving supernatural guidance from the cemetery residents. He explained that over the years, numerous drivers had become lost on the complex network of rural roads and had somehow found their way back to safety with assistance they could not logically explain. Many had mentioned encounters with helpful spirits who seemed to know the area intimately and were committed to ensuring that living people did not come to harm. The experience fundamentally changed my understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, and my appreciation for the kindness that can persist beyond death. I had always been skeptical of supernatural phenomena, but my encounter with Colonel Maxwell, Emily, and the other cemetery residents provided undeniable evidence that consciousness can survive bodily death, and that some spirits choose to use their continued existence to help others. Since that night in Kentucky, I have made several return trips to the area, hoping to visit the cemetery again and perhaps thank the spirits who provided such crucial assistance. However, I have never been able to locate the cemetery or the abandoned chapel, despite following the same route I traveled during my original encounter. It is as if the location exists in a dimension that is accessible only to those who truly need the help that its residents provide. The experience taught me that supernatural encounters are not necessarily frightening or malevolent, but can represent acts of compassion and service that transcend the boundaries between life and death. The spirits I encountered in that Kentucky cemetery demonstrated that love, kindness, and the desire to help others can persist indefinitely, creating connections between strangers that overcome the limitations of time and mortality. My encounter with the helpful spirits of that forgotten cemetery remains one of the most meaningful experiences of my life, demonstrating that we are never truly alone and that assistance can come from the most unexpected sources when we need it most. It taught me to approach the unknown with openness, rather than fear, and to recognize that the supernatural world may be populated by beings who share our values and our commitment to helping others in times of need.
My name is Sofia Garcia, and I live in Miami, Florida. Last spring, I experienced something at a Kentucky cemetery that fundamentally changed my understanding of love, loss, and the connections that transcend death. The story I am about to share involves my beloved grandmother in a supernatural encounter that demonstrated the enduring power of family bonds, even when separated by the veil between life and death. My grandmother, Isabella Garcia, had been the cornerstone of our large Cuban-American family for over 8 decades. She had immigrated to Miami from Cuba in 1962, carrying nothing but her rosary, a photograph of her deceased husband, and an unshakable faith that had sustained her through decades of hardship and eventual prosperity in America. Abuela Isabella, as we all called her, possessed the kind of unconditional love and wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of sacrifice for family. And her sudden death from a heart attack in March 2023 left our entire extended family devastated and struggling to comprehend life without her guiding presence. Due to a series of unfortunate circumstances involving flight cancellations and a family emergency with my young daughter, I was unable to attend Abuela Isabella's funeral in Miami. The guilt and grief I felt about missing her final farewell consumed me for months, creating a profound sense of unfinished business that affected every aspect of my daily life. I had been planning to visit her grave once the immediate chaos surrounding her death had settled, but my grandmother had expressed a specific wish during her final years that complicated my plans for honoring her memory. Abuela Isabella had always spoken fondly of her younger sister, Carmen, who had died in Kentucky during the 1970s while visiting distant relatives who had settled there during an earlier wave of Cuban immigration. Carmen had been buried in Riverside Cemetery in Covington, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati, and my grandmother had always regretted not being able to visit her sister's grave due to financial constraints and family obligations that prevented long-distance travel. During her final months, Abuela Isabella had frequently mentioned her desire to visit Carmen's grave and had made me promise that someone from the family would eventually make the trip to Kentucky to pay respects to her beloved sister. She had kept Carmen's burial information in a small wooden box along with photographs and letters, and she had asked me specifically to ensure that Carmen would not be forgotten by future generations of our family. After months of grief counseling and soul searching about how to properly honor both my grandmother and her sister, I decided to make a pilgrimage to Carmen's grave in Kentucky during the first anniversary of Abuela Isabella's death. I planned the trip as a way to fulfill my grandmother's final wish while also creating a meaningful memorial experience that might help me process my grief and find some sense of closure about missing her funeral. I arrived in Covington, Kentucky on March 15, 2024, exactly 1 year after my grandmother had passed away in Miami. The timing was intentional, as I hoped to create a spiritual connection between the anniversary of Abuela Isabella's death and my visit to her sister's grave. I had brought flowers, candles, photographs of both sisters, and a handwritten letter expressing the family's love and our commitment to remembering both women's contributions to our family's history. Riverside Cemetery proved to be a sprawling and beautifully maintained burial ground that overlooked the Ohio River, with sections dating back to the mid-1800s, and containing graves representing multiple waves of immigration to the Cincinnati area. Finding Carmen's specific grave required assistance from the cemetery office, as the burial had occurred over 40 years earlier, and the records were not easily accessible through online databases. When I finally located Carmen's grave in a quiet section near the cemetery's eastern boundary, I was struck by how peaceful and well-maintained the area appeared. Her headstone was simple but elegant, bearing her name, dates, and a brief inscription in Spanish that spoke of her love for family and her faith in God. I spent the afternoon cleaning the headstone, arranging the flowers I had brought, and simply sitting beside the grave while sharing stories about our family and the changes that had occurred since Carmen's death. As evening approached and the cemetery prepared to close for the night, I made the decision to return after dark to hold a private memorial ceremony that would honor both Carmen and Abuela Isabella simultaneously. I had researched the cemetery's policies and determined that while official visiting hours ended at sunset, the grounds were not actively patrolled during nighttime hours, making it possible for me to conduct a quiet and respectful vigil without disturbing other visitors or violating cemetery regulations. I returned to Riverside Cemetery around 1100 that night, carrying additional candles, a portable chair, and a small speaker that would allow me to play some of my grandmother's favorite Cuban music during the memorial ceremony. The night was clear and cool, with a nearly full moon providing enough natural light to navigate the cemetery paths safely. The atmosphere was profoundly peaceful, with only the distant sounds of traffic from the nearby interstate and the gentle lapping of the Ohio River against its banks. I set up my vigil beside Carmen's grave, lighting candles and arranging photographs of both sisters in a way that created a small shrine dedicated to their memory and their enduring connection to our family. I began the ceremony by reading aloud the letter I had written, expressing our family's love and gratitude for both women's influence on our lives. I played several songs that I knew Abuela Isabella had loved, including traditional Cuban lullabies that she had sung to me during my childhood. As the music played softly in the quiet cemetery, I began to feel an overwhelming sense of peace and connection that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The grief that had been weighing on me for an entire year began to transform into something more positive, a celebration of the love and wisdom that both women had brought to our family's life, and an appreciation for the privilege of being their descendant and the keeper of their memories. It was during this emotional transformation that I experienced the supernatural encounter that would forever change my understanding of death and the continuing bonds between family members. As I sat quietly beside Carmen's grave, listening to the Cuban music and reflecting on my grandmother's life, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the cemetery. Standing approximately 20 feet away near a cluster of older headstones, I saw two women who appeared to be watching my memorial ceremony with expressions of profound joy and appreciation. Even in the moonlight, I could clearly recognize both figures. My grandmother, Isabella, appearing as I remembered her from my childhood when she was still healthy and strong, and a woman who strongly resembled her but was slightly younger and wore clothing typical of the 1970s, whom I instinctively knew must be her sister, Carmen. Both women appeared translucent but clearly defined, with facial features and expressions that conveyed their personalities as distinctly as if they were still living. Abuela Isabella had the gentle smile and knowing eyes that I remembered from countless family gatherings, while Carmen possessed a similar warmth, but with a slightly more reserved demeanor that suggested the cultural differences she had experienced living away from the large Cuban community in Miami. They approached slowly, moving with the graceful dignity that I associated with my grandmother's generation of Cuban women. And when they reached the area where I was sitting, both women smiled at me with an expression of such love and gratitude that I immediately began weeping with joy rather than fear. Abuela Isabella spoke first, her voice carrying the familiar accent and intonation that had been such a comfort during my childhood, though her words seemed to come from a great distance. She told me how proud she was that I had made the journey to Kentucky to honor Carmen's memory and fulfill the promise I had made during her final months. She explained that she and Carmen had been waiting for this moment, when someone from the family would finally visit Carmen's grave and acknowledge her place in our family history. She said that Carmen had been lonely in the Kentucky cemetery, separated from the large Cuban community that had defined so much of their shared cultural identity, but that my visit had created a bridge between Carmen's isolated grave and the family connections that had sustained both sisters throughout their lives. Carmen spoke next, her voice carrying a slight Kentucky accent that she had apparently acquired during her years living in the area, but still retaining the musical quality that characterized the Spanish spoken by their generation. She thanked me for bringing photographs and music from home, explaining that she had not heard Cuban music or seen pictures of family members since her death in the 1970s. She told me about her years in Kentucky and how she had missed the large family gatherings and cultural traditions that had been such an important part of their childhood in Cuba and their early years in Miami. Most importantly, both women emphasized that my visit had allowed them to be reunited in death after decades of separation, and that they would no longer be alone in their respective resting places. Abuela Isabella explained that spiritual connections between family members can transcend physical distance, but that these connections are strengthened when living family members take deliberate action to honor and remember those who have passed away. They asked me to convey specific messages to various family members, sharing memories and expressions of love that demonstrated their continuing awareness of our lives and their ongoing concern for our well-being. They spoke about family members' recent achievements, challenges, and changes in ways that indicated their spiritual presence had allowed them to remain connected to our family's ongoing story. The conversation lasted for what seemed like hours, though time felt strangely distorted during the encounter. When the sisters finally began to fade from view, they both embraced me in a way that felt completely physical despite their translucent appearance, and I experienced the same sense of unconditional love and protection that I had always felt in my grandmother's presence during her lifetime. As they disappeared into the moonlit cemetery landscape, I felt a profound sense of completion and peace that had been absent from my life since Abuela Isabella's death. The guilt about missing her funeral had been replaced by gratitude for the opportunity to experience this supernatural reunion, and my grief had been transformed into a celebration of the continuing love that connects our family across the boundaries of life and death. When I returned to Miami the following week, I shared my experience with other family members, many of whom reported that they had felt a sudden sense of peace and connection to Abuela Isabella around the same time as my visit to Kentucky. Several relatives mentioned dreams or other experiences that suggested our grandmother's spirit had somehow become more accessible to the family following her reunion with Carmen in the cemetery. The encounter at Riverside Cemetery taught me that love truly transcends death, and that our connections to deceased family members can be maintained and strengthened through deliberate acts of remembrance and honor. The supernatural reunion I witnessed demonstrated that death is not an ending but a transformation, and that family bonds can persist indefinitely when they are nurtured by the living through memory, respect, and ongoing communication with those who have passed away. Since that night in Kentucky, I have made annual pilgrimage trips to both Carmen's grave in Covington and Abuela Isabella's grave in Miami, maintaining the connection between the sisters and ensuring that both women remain active parts of our family's ongoing story. These visits have become meaningful traditions that strengthen our family's sense of identity and continuity, while also providing opportunities for spiritual encounters that remind us of the enduring nature of love and the continuing presence of those who have shaped our lives. My experience at Riverside Cemetery fundamentally changed my understanding of death and mourning, transforming my grief from a source of pain into a source of connection and strength. The supernatural encounter with my grandmother and her sister demonstrated that memorial ceremonies and acts of remembrance are not simply symbolic gestures, but real communications that can create bridges between the world of the living and whatever existence continues beyond physical death. The lesson I learned that night is that death cannot diminish love and that our obligations to deceased family members continue indefinitely. By honoring their memories and maintaining their place in our family's ongoing story, we create opportunities for continued connection and communication that enrich both our own lives and the spiritual existence of those we have lost.